We've got the pressure campaign by the U.S. to persuade Britain to ban Huawei. That pressure campaign intensifying, with Secretary of State Mike Pompeo tweeting that the U.K. faces a, quote, momentous decision that could affect its sovereignty. The U.S. is demanding an outright ban on the Chinese company, citing security concerns over Huawei's links to the Chinese government. Aikiko, you have been following Huawei quite closely. How significant is this sort of ratcheting up of pressure from Pompeo?
Well, it's certainly significant for the U.S. because when you think about the last year, this campaign that the U.S. has mounted in trying to get allies on board to ban Huawei simply hasn't worked beyond countries like Australia and Japan to a certain extent. And the U.K. is certainly an important one because if you look at other countries like Germany, they have said they're going to move forward with the use of Huawei. And let's talk about the timing of all of this, because this comes as the U.K. prepares to really formally kick off these trade discussions with the U.S. as they exit the EU. I think you're going to want to see how the U.S. responds on something like this. And Mike Pompeo in the past has said that any country that uses Huawei, they will have to rethink the intelligence sharing agreement that's in place. And that's a pretty significant statement to put out there.
How does Pompeo respond to what Boris Johnson said in an interview earlier this month with the BBC? If people oppose one brand or another, then they have to tell us what's the alternative.
Well, there's always been inconsistency, I feel like, in the story between Huawei and the way that the technology has been uptaken by different nations. I mean, recall when the United States had initially said that technology from Huawei actually presented a national security threat, there was a little bit of wishy-washiness in the UK about whether or not their government should also interpret it as a national security threat themselves. And a lot of that boiled down to what was the interpretation of whether or not the technology within Huawei was actually quarantinable so that you could allow the hardware in those jurisdictions, but then not actually face the security threat. Now, we actually saw that the UK was kind of confused about which way to address it. It seems like that's kind of what we're seeing now is an extension of that uncertainty about to what degree you can actually call this a national security threat.
And I think that, you know, to your question about the alternative, what we're starting to see here in the U.S. is that conversation start to move forward. We heard from Defense Secretary Mark Esper last month talking about the department looking into building out these alternatives. We saw a bill introduced in Congress to try and invest money to build out alternatives to 5G. But at this stage in the game, it really is pretty late when you think about all these other countries that are competing against each other to build out their 5G infrastructure. And Huawei has the entire stack ready to go.
Does this fight over 5G delay plans? For instance, we're expecting an Apple 5G phone. Does it push that back even further? There are already rumblings that it's going to get pushed back.
Well, I don't think it's going to affect the Apple phone per se, because that's not those aren't the parts that Huawei are building out. We're talking about the basic infrastructure.
Yeah, the infrastructure, but if there's not an infrastructure, would they want to market a phone if you can't use it?
Well, it's a good question for abroad. I think in the U.S. it doesn't, because the U.S. doesn't use Huawei equipment at all.
Hey investors, Zach Guzman here. Are you interested in learning more about the markets and getting the latest financial news? Well, then click right here to subscribe to our Yahoo Finance YouTube channel. Get the latest up-to-the-minute market analysis, big interviews in the world of finance, and information on how to manage your money every day wherever you are.